In June 1916, the team members convinced their parents to buy them a Curtiss flying boat and hire an instructor so they could learn how to fly. After 6 hours of instruction, they were pilots. And with great enthusiasm, the entire group, 29 men strong, joined the Navy as naval aviators. Soon afterward, America entered the war. 20 years earlier, it might not have. But Theodore Roosevelt's vision had made America a world power with world responsibilities. And the vision of a few innovative men had given it a primitive but effective new technology to use in the war: naval aviation. The main job of these early aviators was to find German submarines, which were sinking ships carrying vital supplies from America to Britain. Naval aviators flew almost 1 million miles of these anti-submarine patrol flights, and they greatly reduced the German submarines' effectiveness.
The patrols were long and tedious and very artsome, but it got to be like an old milk route to the gang that were there for any length of time. Our equipment consisted of 2 Mark IV bombs, which were slung underneath the wings on either side of us, Lewis machine guns, an Alice lamp, and 2 carrier pigeons. Of course, we had radio, which was the Dada system in those days, but sometimes it didn't work, and our facilities ashore were not very good anyway. But we understand, after months of operation from our commanding officer, that the sinkings within our area were greatly reduced since taking over from the French Navy.
Americans were overjoyed when the terribly costly World War I came to an end. Hundreds of thousands had died, and America was truly ready for peace.
The Americans of that period saw their experience as having transformed the world. And there was no need for America to stay and, police things. Prussian militarism, which is what Wilson called it, had been wiped out. So all that America had to do now is return to what was really important. As Calvin Coolidge said, the business of America is business. And that's absolutely true. Americans don't like politics. They don't like ideology, except their own, of course, which they don't consider ideological. But anyway, Americans wanted to return to their kind of free and former innocent self.
This is Constitution Hall in Washington, D.C. It was here, in October 1921, that representatives of the world's major naval powers, Britain, France, Italy, and Japan, gathered at the invitation of the United States to try to work out a way to stop any new naval arms race before it began. But ironically, the treaty led directly to the development of a technology that would become even more costly and destructive, a technology that would play a major role in world affairs. Britain, the United States, and Japan were each in the midst of building a pair of new battle cruisers, and as an afterthought, they agreed that they could keep building them so long as each was converted into a vessel generally thought of as defensive, the aircraft carrier. But the 2 carriers the United States built as a result of the treaty weren't like the Langley. The Lexington and the Saratoga were the largest and fastest warships in the world. And Navy leaders soon discovered that when you put dive bombers, fighters, and torpedo planes on these carriers, you had a potentially formidable offensive weapon. America was in the midst of a technological revolution, but Navy leaders were aware that halfway around the world, another nation was also building carriers with offensive capabilities: Japan. Could this naval fleet come into direct conflict with America? The U.S. Navy wasn't sure. The Washington Arms Treaty limited Japan to a navy only 60% the size of America's, but America kept military spending to a minimum, while Japan built every last warship she was allowed.
The problem was that after Russia had been defeated in 1905, the Japanese Navy didn't have an enemy anymore. They're looking around, and we, of course, had taken the Philippines in the Spanish-American War from Spain. So naturally, the Japanese Navy thought the Americans were the enemy. So they began to develop their strategy for defeating the United States Navy much the way they had the Russians. That is, lure the American fleet across the Pacific, which is what we had planned to do, and then destroy us in their own coastal waters.
Japanese leaders viewed Asia as part of their domain and dreamed of the rest of the countries of the world as Japanese client states under a giant Japanese pagoda. In 1931, while the world was in the midst of a Great Depression, a group of fanatic army officers seized control and sent troops into the Chinese province of Manchuria. The invasion was quick and brutal. It was supported by airplanes which bombed Manchurian cities. The first time in history, carrier-based aircraft were used as offensive weapons. In the United States, the Depression brought a new president to Washington, Franklin Roosevelt. Roosevelt, like his cousin Theodore before him, had worked in the Navy Department. That experience taught him how important a powerful Navy could be in an international conflict.
Make good on that opportunity. Make good on it and keep the faith. And let me tell you that from the bottom of my heart, in coming here, not only as the Commander-in-Chief of the Navy of the United States, but also as one who can only say unofficially, but who does say to you unofficially, that he loves the United States Navy more than any other branch of our government.
Franklin Roosevelt becomes president in 1933. At that time, the world is already in a much less stable state than it was, let's say, 10 years earlier. The Japanese are fighting on the mainland of Asia. Hitler is already pushing. I think that President Roosevelt has sensed quite early that things were getting worse and they were going to get a lot worse before they got any better.
Roosevelt poured every dime he could into building a formidable navy, hoping it would make America and her Pacific possessions, the Philippines and Hawaii, less attractive targets for the Japanese expansionists. He justified this expenditure by making it part of his program to pull America out of the Depression.
Roosevelt put most of the money into the Navy. There was no question of putting much money into the Army because the Army would probably not be engaged if, as he hoped, the United States didn't get into a war.
Arms for the love of America. They speak in a foreign land.
The Navy was a deterrent. The Navy would keep the United States safe, and if we had to fight, would protect us in the early stages when we built up an army. That's classic American strategy of that time. He put a lot of money into the Navy in many ways, but that included a lot of money into naval aviation.
The Japanese were also putting a lot of money into naval aviation, training pilots and building new fighter aircraft. And they were matching America carrier for carrier and airplane for airplane. Behind that effort was a visionary and strategic genius, Isoroku Yamamoto, a man who passionately believed in naval aviation. Before his career would end, Admiral Yamamoto would use naval air power as it had never been used before, and he would engage America in the largest naval air battles in history. As a young officer, Yamamoto had spent almost 4 years serving in the Japanese embassy in Washington. While in America, he saw the oil wells of Texas and the production lines of Detroit. He studied at Harvard and made poker table friendships with American Navy officers. He saw America's aircraft carriers, the Langley, the Lexington, and the Saratoga, and he came home convinced that Japan's future lay in naval aviation. Yamamoto was not part of the clique of Army fanatics ruling Japan. In fact, he and many other Navy officers, Western educated and trained, were strongly opposed to Japanese militarism. They believed it would eventually lead Japan into a war with the industrial might of America. In the late 1930s, Yamamoto and his fellow officers did all they could to slow down Japan's military adventurism. This effort caused an internal war between the Army and Navy, and it put Yamamoto in a very precarious position.
It's hard to appreciate the difference in this between the Army and the Navy in Japanese society. Here the Army's running things. General Tojo was taking over right before the war broke out, and the two just hardly spoke to each other. Great story once, they're sitting in a big staff meeting. Yamamoto's sitting next to Tojo, and Tojo stands up, he's banging on the table and everything. Goes to sit down, he falls on the floor. Yamamoto had pulled his chair out, and you can imagine these guys sitting there with frozen faces, and no one dared laugh, but that's what they thought of each other.